My name's Aonghus Fraser. I work at a company called C5. Most people call me Gus, so that's fine. We've got about 160 consultants strictly in the Channel Islands, so in Jersey and Guernsey. I run the local user group there and the SharePoint Saturday. I've been coming to this conference for a while. It's definitely the best one as a speaker and as a delegate. I think the quality of the sessions have been great so far, so I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to contact me, I've left my contact details down there. We can catch me on Twitter as well. So I was talking about last night briefly. Don't get a caricature done because it doesn't look like you at all. I think this guy looks terrible. It's not a good likeness. Or do it if you want for a laugh. I thought it was pretty funny. So yeah, just a little bit about Jersey, Guernsey. That's actually where they are. So not a lot of people actually know that they are closer to France. They're not part of the UK though, so Bing Maps has got that wrong. It's actually separate jurisdictions. So today we're going to cover a bit about the out-of-the-box options between SharePoint and CRM. Is anyone using that, the out-of-the-box CRM and SharePoint integration? Okay, so I will cover a brief bit about that and the limitations. Then a little bit about the architecture options in terms of how to configure systems and the merits of each approach. A little bit about the Azure Service Bus, demonstration of the Azure Service Bus, and then some Q&A at the end. So the out-of-the-box SharePoint CRM integration is pretty, it's got limited flexibility. You really are mapping one folder per CRM entity. So when I talk about some CRM terms, I'm going to explain them in a SharePoint context. So for example, a CRM entity is kind of like a content type. So you've got accounts, contacts, things like that. There are also some security limitations as well. So for example, a lot of our customers are using CRM and they've got unique permissions on some of their clients' accounts, contacts, and things like that. And these don't get mapped through to the SharePoint side of things. So what happens is that you've got a very granular and very robust security model in CRM, but yet the documents associated with those entities don't have the same security settings. So you cannot implement a secure solution if you've got complex security models in CRM by using the out-of-the-box integration. This is just a quick few screens of how you would set this up. This is Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015 online, and it is pretty straightforward these days to set it up if you want the native integration. So what you end up doing is you decide which of your entities you want to have mapped to SharePoint document libraries. What's going to happen here is you set up the URL, so there's a base URL at the bottom, and that's going to be a site collection in SharePoint. And for every one of the entities, so I talked about them being kind of like content types, but every CRM entity that you have in this kind of view, you can decide whether or not you want to have document management enabled. When you decide that you do want to have some document management enabled, what it will do is it will create that document library. The problem is, for me, you go on through the settings, it will create the document libraries, and it will tell you straight away where it's created those within your site collection. So you'll basically have a number of different document libraries. And it will create these. So for me, that's not very granular, and you've basically got a document library here, one for each of those entities we'd seen previously. And that means that you're going to store everything in one document library for all the contacts. So it will create a folder for each of the individual contacts. So if I've got company ABC, all of company ABC's documents are going to be in one folder within that document library. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not really a big fan of folders in general. So it kind of falls down a little bit for me in that regard. Having said that, it only takes a few minutes to configure it. So it is worth considering if you've got a simple security model and you don't have tens of thousands of contacts or accounts. If you've got a few hundred, it may well be appropriate. And so we do have some customers using that. It works fine. It's when you start adding some complexity around security, you want to start building other things for that client, so client sites and things like that. It just doesn't work. So a little bit about the point-to-point versus the service bus architecture. Any BizTalk people in the room? Okay, great. So you guys know what service bus really is, enterprise service bus. What I'm going to talk about is not so much the enterprise scale service bus like BizTalk with transformations and things. It's more about messaging and decoupling systems. So it's a kind of a basic service bus rather than the full all singing, all dancing transformational BizTalk side of things. So with the point-to-point integration, we're talking about a direct connection between two systems. So for example, a CRM plugin. So CRM plugin is kind of like an event receiver, basically. So something happens in CRM, triggers an event, we want to do something else. And that's a point-to-point type of integration that you could have. It's tightly coupled, so the two things are really connected together. And it fails ungracefully. And this is something that I'm going to talk about a bit, because for me, it's the single biggest advantage of using a service bus architecture is that you've got failing gracefully. Now, I'm not generally a pessimist, but I do know that in IT, things go wrong a fair bit. And when they go wrong, we want to recover from them easily. So we'll show you how to recover easily from failures using the service bus architecture. It's not very suitable when you've got multiple systems. So for example, I think if you're talking about adding multiple systems that want to know about that update, you've added a new account into CRM, you've got line of business systems that want to know about that, you've got SharePoint that wants to know about that, you've got all manner of potentially line of business systems that really want to understand what's happening in the source system. Once you start adding multiple systems, it becomes a bit more difficult. And migrating and upgrading each side of the point-to-point becomes complex and difficult to manage. It also doesn't scale very well. So it's a very, it doesn't scale. So here's just a brief example of point-to-point example. You might have SharePoint and CRM, and they need to talk to each other. So CRM wants to talk to SharePoint when an account is updated. SharePoint's going to talk to CRM to let it know where the document libraries are for a particular entity or something like that. You've also maybe got a line of business system that's connected to SharePoint somehow, maybe with BCS or something like that, and CRM. You've also maybe got some SQL. And so you can see already when you're doing point-to-point connections and integration between these systems, you're going to have a lot of different connections altogether. You add one more system that wants to understand what's going on in your organization, and all of a sudden you've got to build 4 more connections. So these the kind of brittle connections with these other source systems, I find is okay with 1 or 2 systems, but once you start scaling out, you've got a lot of people interested in what's maybe happening in CRM. All of these other source systems potentially want to know what's happening. Then it starts to fall down as an architecture. You end up with stuff like this, really. And before you know it, you've got sticky plasters all over the place, and it's really difficult to maintain, complex and expensive. Whereas the service bus architecture is where all the different systems are talking to the service bus in the middle. And the really nice thing about this is that when you add one more system, you can add just one more connection. So none of these external systems here that we had on the previous slide really need to know about the line of business system here. It's a kind of publish-subscribe model in the same way as you might have an observer pattern in typical software development. So the service bus architecture is loosely coupled, it's scalable, it's less complex, fewer connections as well, and it's easier to upgrade and migrate the system. So back here, if we need to upgrade CRM, SharePoint, SQL, line of business systems, it really doesn't matter which. The other platforms don't really even need to know about that. You can disconnect from the service bus and pick things up again once you've upgraded the source system. So it's just a lot more flexible. So a little bit about the Azure Service Bus overview and some of the terminology, as none of us are really using it in production at the moment. It's a lightweight cloud messaging service. It's not BizTalk services in the cloud. It's not a full enterprise service bus with transformational rules. We're talking about sending individual messages between systems that allow us to connect them up. You can connect anything on-premises or in the cloud. So we're actually using this in a few instances where we're connecting on-premises systems with cloud services as well. It is cheap. That is ridiculously cheap. £6 per month, more or less, at the latest rates. The first 12.5 million operations per month are included. So it just shows that it's a very scalable model, and yeah, we don't have 12.5 million clients. So in our CRM to SharePoint integration, we're well within the limits, and it's costing us literally pennies to have the messaging in a secure and robust way. It's also very flexible. There are a number of different source SDKs, basically. So if you're a .NET developer, great, all the sources are going to be there for connecting up. And if you're using any of the other technologies as well, so we actually have some other suppliers for some of our clients are actually integrating with the Azure Service Bus. We'll give them the keys for them to connect up to it, and they're writing things in Java. So there is a little bit of a difference between the basic versus standard. We're actually going to be looking today at the standard version of the Azure Service Bus, mainly because of the topics feature here. So I'll talk about queues and topics in a minute. And yeah, that's basically a subtle difference between the two. So Azure Service Bus queues. Now a queue is effectively a means of getting a message from one place to another. It's a one-to-one kind of implementation. So you might have the senders here, but you really only have one subscriber here. So that's of limited value when we're talking about trying to couple up a lot of different systems in the examples that we're going to show you. So a topic, on the other hand, is where we've got multiple subscribers. So you've got one subscriber in the queue, multiple subscribers in the topic. That's probably the easiest way to explain how that works. You've also got a namespace in here, which I'll talk about and show you how to manage that. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of these SDKs, so any of these different environments, you can build solutions against the Azure Service Bus. It's a fairly straightforward, and there's not much code involved in doing that. So I'm going to show you a bit about the Azure Service Bus namespace and topic setup, and we're going to have a look through some of the Azure Management Portal to do some of that. So this is the Azure Management Portal, which you may be familiar with. And I've actually got a namespace already set up for this. You can create a new namespace. I'm just going to see how well it behaves at this resolution. Yeah. So what I'm going to show you is that within the Azure portal, you can create a namespace, but actually the best way of doing it is to use PowerShell. And the reason for that is this final part of the command here, create ACS namespace true. You can't do that through the portal. So if you wanted to create a namespace, which is a unique namespace that takes the location of your yeah, it's better to be using the portal on a higher resolution. Let me just get out of this. So you can create the namespace through the portal. You select your region and so on. You'll be selecting messaging, and I talked about the basic versus standard before and the region, but you won't get to use that namespace, which, sorry, the ACS namespace, which is important for what we're doing, because we're going to have Azure ACS handling the claims between CRM Online and Azure, so that will be able to broker those messages for us to subscribe to from our other systems. Another important point is that I was talking about the queues versus topics before. So a queue is kind of the one-to-one. We're going to create a topic. If you quick create a topic, it will create it with the default settings, but you really want to be careful not to do that in many cases because you don't get the flexibility configuring a topic. So this particular little checkbox is enabled by default, this enable partitioning. I would uncheck that unless you've got a proper reason for using that, because for example, the CRM integration just simply won't work with partitioned topics, and you could be there for a while trying to work out why it's not working. There's no way of reconfiguring that easily once it's been configured as well. So it's kind of a setup thing that you need to be aware of when you're creating that, and not something that you just want to change later on. Okay, so that's how you set up the namespace. Basically use that PowerShell, and then you create a topic. And the next thing is you want to connect Dynamics CRM to the service bus. So Dynamics CRM in this example is going to be our source system. It's going to be where we have our clients, our accounts, things like that, and we want to connect that up so that our other systems can subscribe and act on the messages. So luckily with Dynamics CRM, there is an SDK. It's actually a very good SDK. There are a lot of code examples in there, and I'm actually just going to show you where the SDK is, because and what it consists of. So CRM 2015 SDK, and there are some tools in here. One of them is called the plugin registration tool. So the CRM plugins are kind of like event receivers in SharePoint world. And yeah, I'm going to have to log in again because I had to reboot the machine. So let me just connect up to a demo environment. So what this is doing is it's a tool that's looking at the CRM Online environment. It's allowing me to register plugins, and it's allowing me to register service endpoints. So if I look at the service endpoint here, I've already created one. Effectively, that's the connection between CRM Online and Azure so that we can talk to the Azure Service Bus. And this only works once you've set up that Azure namespace as part of your topic. So just going to talk through some of these. So you've got a name description, fairly straightforward. The namespace that we created as part of the PowerShell. You've also got the path, which should be the name of the topic or the name of your queue or whatever it might be. And you can decide what kind of contact it is. So in this case, it's a topic, but you have a number of other different services as part of the service bus, a one-way, two-way, a queue, and so on. In this case, we want the topic because that's the most appropriate. We've got a publish, message, and multiple subscribers. You can configure the ACS. I'm not going to do that now because some of these things take a few seconds. It's not very interesting to watch. But once you've got your service endpoint registered, that's basically the connectivity set up between CRM Online and the Azure Service Bus. The next thing we want to do is, once we've got the service point set up, we'd want to work out, well, what is it that we're interested in tracking? So what kind of messages do we want to send to the service bus? So what we'll do is we can add steps, they're called, but effectively if you can kind of map that to event receivers in SharePoint, we've got update of account or create of account. So in this example, I'm going to show you when you create an account or update an account in CRM, we're going to send that message to the service bus. And each one of these, you're basically looking at what the message is. And in this tool, you can decide what sort of message it will type ahead for you. So if I type create, for example, and you can select the primary entity you're dealing with as well, so the CRM entity. And this is looking up through the SDK, through the APIs, what kind of entities you've got. So it's fairly straightforward to set this up. The things you want to be aware of on this are that it only really works asynchronously. So the default is synchronous, but you would set that to asynchronous. So you've got a couple of steps here, and that's just kind of the CRM side of things set up from then. So you're basically saying, we've connected CRM to the Azure Service Bus, we've decided we want to trigger some events on updating of account, and that's the CRM side of things set up. So that's the first part of the setup. So the next bit is, so we saw the plugin is the kind of event receiver. If we go back to that tool, actually, what we can see is that you can register other plugins. So there is a native Azure plugin, which is what we've been configuring, but actually you could write your own plugin. So you could write your own plugin in the same way as you write event receivers in SharePoint to connect with the Azure Service Bus. But actually we're happy enough with the way that the native one works because all we're doing is triggering updates based on updates of accounts or new accounts. The Azure ACS handles the claims, so there is some configuration on those steps from the SDK tool for CRM, and that will actually set up the claims within the Azure ACS to do that mapping. And we use that tool to configure and activate the connectivity. Another thing to be aware of is the versions of .NET that we're looking at. So the version of the CRM SDK, if you download it today, CRM 2015, is 4.5.2, but interestingly, that's not fully supported in Azure. So if you're wanting to set up an Azure service and run a console app or something in Azure, I think 4.5.0 or 4.5.1 is the latest version. So there's a bit of a mismatch, and you kind of need to find an older version of the CRM 2015 SDK, not a lot older, but a little bit older if you want that to work fully in terms of the Azure environment. So that's just a little gotcha. So I've covered through some of those steps. The next thing I'm going to do is show you how to create a cloud service, which is basically a console app running in the cloud. And the reason we're doing that is because we want something sitting there all the time as a subscriber to our message to the enterprise, to the service bus, basically, to that topic that we created on CRM. And then we're going to do something with it, in this case, post to Yammer. So there are a couple of points in setting up your project for this in Visual Studio. There is already a project template called the Azure Cloud Service. And if you set up the worker role with a service bus queue, it already knows how to connect up to the Azure Service Bus. So you're not having to write a lot of code for that. So I just wanted to show you those 2 steps just to make sure that we're not having to write a lot of code. The templates are already there. And in this case, I've got a role, so an Azure role that's going to be running in basically a VM in Azure. And it's a worker role with a service bus queue, which means that the code is already going to be there to pick up some messages. All I need to do is set up the connectivity to that queue using the right keys and so on, so I can pick up the right messages. So if I go back to my, go to Visual Studio, so I'm going to start up a couple of these projects and show you what's going to happen when we trigger some events in CRM. So this is the, can you see that okay? Yeah, great. So we've got, this is the first project. It's a Yammer listener service. It's going to listen to the Azure Service Bus, and it's going to post a message onto Yammer when something happens in CRM. I'm going to debug these so that we can step through them. It's a bit more interesting than running it actually in the cloud where there's limited opportunity to debug it. And then I have a very similar one, which is a SharePoint listener, which is going to create a client site for each of the accounts that we're going to create in CRM. So as I mentioned before, the limited integration that comes out of the box with CRM and SharePoint is that you get a folder per CRM entity, which isn't really ideal. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to create a SharePoint site for every client that we create or every account that we create in CRM. It's a much more flexible way of managing our documents and integration, for example. So if I go to the, I'm going to show you CRM. Let's just check these are up and running. That's good. So I'm going to go to CRM and had to start all this up again because I had to reboot the machine. So, okay, so this is vanilla SharePoint, CRM 2015, and I've not really customized this to any great extent. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can create an account in this case. So using the quick, this is a new feature in CRM 2015, being able to create accounts and cases and things quickly. First thing we do is going to create an account. I'm going to call it SP. Let's call it Combined Knowledge, actually. That's more like a real name. So it's created that account successfully. Great. So I'm going to show you that that's just the basic record that's been created. If I go to my Yammer service, which would ordinarily be hosted in the cloud, and a couple of things here that I'm going to show you at this resolution, which okay, so what's happened is I've picked up the message from the service bus. A lot of this code exists already in my template document, in my template for the worker role. So when I run the project, I'm going to pick up some configuration settings, just the topic, the connection string, and so on. And then I'm going to pick up the messages themselves. When I pick up the messages, the things that I need to be careful of here are that we need to understand what the message is saying. It's serialized using CRM data. So we actually need to pick up, we need to be using the CRM SDK for that. And I've got a class that I've generated using the CRM SDK because we need to generate the proxies basically for the CRM entities so that we can deserialize the message from the service bus. But when I receive the messages, we pick them up, we decide what are we going to do. In this case, it's an account that we've created, so we're going to handle an account update. And then once that's happy, we're going to say the message has been complete. So when you complete your message, that's us telling the service bus that everything's happened correctly. If there was a problem, however, and if there's an exception that we've hit, then we abandon the message. And what's going to happen there is we leave the message on the queue. So one of the nice things about using the Azure Service Bus is that the default period that a message can last for is 14 days. So I don't know about you, but when systems go down or we upgrade systems, 14 days is a long time to be remembering that we still have to do something when we fix the problem that we had. So that works pretty well when we're setting up our topics and our subscriptions to those topics within the Azure Service Bus. Means that we're okay with things going down as long as we remember to pick them up and do what we were supposed to do when they were up and running again. So in this case, what we're going to do is post a message on Yammer. So I'm just going to carry on and make that post, and it's successfully posted. So if I go to Yammer now, so apologies, I'm having to log in all over the place because of the to reboot the machine a minute ago. So I've got some messages from earlier in the queue. That's fine, which is, I guess, a good example. I was running some tests earlier, and they're only getting posted now because I disconnected everything for a while. So here we go. I'm back in Yammer now, and I can see that the account Combined Knowledge was created in CRM. That was posted 10 seconds ago from my app, SP Evo 15. And those previous ones, again, they've been sat in the queue since earlier this morning. So now I'll show you the SharePoint side of things as well. So what we've got on the SharePoint side is we've also got a similar project. We've got a cloud service that we're listening to, and what we're doing in our worker role, which is one of the classes that's generated for you as part of the template, is that we are picking up the same message, and let me just jump to the handle account update. We use the CRM SDK, so we've got a CRM connection that we're parsing, and we're going to convert the message so that we know that it's an account. We're going to get the account name. We're going to add or update an account site in SharePoint. So we take the account name, check if some document libraries exist. We use the client-side object model in this case. So if there's no site, we're going to create a site. And this is just using standard kind of CSOM code for this. And we're also going to check that there's a CRM document library. So we're going to say where there is a CRM document library, get a reference to that. And the last thing we want to do is we want to update CRM, because what happens is you create the account in CRM, send a message to the service bus, and then you might create the site in SharePoint, but CRM doesn't know anything about that, so CRM is disconnected. So we go back to CRM to tell it, hang on a minute, for the Combined Knowledge account that you've just created, here's the document library in CRM that we're mapping to. So I'll show you what's happened in the in SharePoint. And we've got a site called Combined Knowledge that was modified 5 minutes ago. So that was the site that was created here. And within the Combined Knowledge site, we've got a folder called CRM, a document library called CRM rather, and we've got some networking issues, I think. And this document library is mapped back to the CRM entity Combined Knowledge over here. So if I look at Combined Knowledge in CRM, I can have a look at the documents folder, the documents tab, and that's basically a view onto the same document library. So just to show you how that kind of works, I could create a Word document and call it account doc. And then go back to the CRM all documents within Combined Knowledge, and the account doc is there. So what we've ended up doing is, instead of creating a folder for each CRM entity, we've now got a site for each CRM entity. And obviously that's just a fairly simple example where we're saying that we've got something happening in CRM, we want to trigger a message, and then the SharePoint listener or subscriber is going to do something with that. I'm going to go into the Service Bus portal, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the namespace and the topic that we've created. So the topic that we created it's got a couple of subscriptions, and you get a basic amount of statistics there to show you that you've got some requests coming in and out and so on. And then you can see the subscriptions themselves. So for every system that wants to know about the message or the types of messages coming from CRM, you're going to have a different subscriber here. And you can create, delete, edit these. And what I'm going to show you is when you decide that one of the subscribers shouldn't be working anymore. So for example, if I edit the Yammer subscriber, I can make that topic subscription state disabled. And what that will mean is that we could be modifying the source system or this Yammer system or something. We're saying we're not ready to receive those messages right now. So I'm going to make this disabled. It's going to update the subscription, so it's disabled. That means Yammer's not going to know when we update an account in CRM. So if I go back to CRM here, and I'll create a new account. What will happen is we'll end up having the SharePoint site created. Oops. So we've got a site for each, so we've got another account. So that was created fairly quickly. But the Yammer, it's not going to be posting to Yammer at the moment because we can't pick up from the feed. If I just go and re-enable so if I go to Yammer here, we're not going to have a post at all. It's just still going to be saying the latest one will be the combined knowledge one we created. Still nothing. If I go back to the service bus, I could then enable that topic, the subscriber again. Probably have to go back to Visual Studio and hit continue again. And then it'll complete the message this time. So it's really nice the way that you can decouple your systems, and you don't really need to focus so much on the connectivity. You can decide that you want to upgrade a source system, and we've done this a number of times where something has to go down. So our internal systems that we're connecting up SharePoint, CRM, 2 line of business systems, and when we need to upgrade one of them, we just disable the subscriber, and then we re-enable it when we're ready again. And the messages live on the queue for 14 days. So we've got, well, that you can customize that as well. So if I go back to our topic, you can see the default message time to live is 14 days. So obviously you can configure that how you like, but that's quite a powerful piece of functionality to be able to disconnect your systems for hours or days while you upgrade them, so that you can join them back up again later, and the messages will still be there. So failing gracefully is probably the single biggest reason for doing this, aside from the flexibility for creating more complex environments in SharePoint than the native integration does with a folder for each entity. So you can also add filtering on messages as well, and you can have you can decide from your subscribers whether you want, what sort of messages you're interested in. In this case, I've added the business logic is actually all in our subscriber projects. So if I go back to the Yammer project, we're doing some switching of whatever it is we're looking for here. So in this case, if it's an account, we're going to handle the account update, and we're going to do whatever we need to do there. You can actually have filtering within some of the topics and subscribers as well before it even hits this role here. So this is a role that you would normally publish to Azure because I don't want to be running Visual Studio to pick up those messages most of the time. So what you'd end up doing is you would publish this to yeah, a bit stuck here. So the cloud services option, is anyone using cloud services? Basically a console application running in the cloud. And when you create that project template, you can publish it up to Azure, and it's effectively a little VM that's running in the cloud as a console app. You can even remote desktop onto it if you want to. So you typically have your subscribers sitting there picking up the messages from the Azure Service Bus and doing whatever it is they need to do. It is a console app. It would actually be running in a console session on the VM. And you can actually scale this out as well. So if you're talking about having a service where you're going to have a lot of throughput, you can scale it out and you can decide that you want to have multiple instances in the same way as you'd scale up your VMs, for example. So it's quite a scalable approach if you're going to have a lot of, you can see here it's the one instance, it's just a small one because we're only picking up a few messages. But if you start to have a high amount of throughput, then you would end up potentially scaling this out and picking up a lot of messages and handling a lot of that. You saw the numbers before, 12.5 million, I think, messages are included. So if you're doing anything interesting like that, I'd be quite interested to hear about it. I think the highest throughput that we've got at the moment is we've got a use case where we've got a few updates a second. So we're not talking about millions, we're talking about maybe hundreds of thousands of little messages using the Azure Service Bus for that. So I've covered the native integration briefly and showed you how from the using the CRM SDK you can configure the connectivity to the Azure Service Bus, and then it's really up to you to decide what it is you want to do from your subscriber. So I've got, just as an example, those two subscribers, the Yammer subscriber and the SharePoint subscriber. I'm happy to publish the code for some of this because it's really not complicated. Yep.
How did CRM know the location of the documents in SharePoint?
Okay, good question. Yeah, so this was when we update, so I'll go to that bit of code in the SharePoint side of things. This is where you need this XRM bit of code. This is generated using a part of the SDK. So what you end up doing is you need to call, it's like an SVC utility that will look at the CRM web services, and then it will say, I'm going to generate classes, proxy classes for all of the entities in CRM, because you might have custom entities. So in this case, I used a native account entity, but if you had something like a quote as a native one, a custom entity of some description, you'd want to have the proxy classes for that in your code. So with that XRM bit of code here, which I'll just might as well open it up. It's a giant bit of code. Yeah, so I'm actually not going to go through all of that in detail. But
That's running in the subscriber.
That is running in my subscriber, exactly. So I've got my CRM SharePoint Listener Cloud service, which is running in that little Azure VM, or in debug mode, it's just running locally. And if I try and, let me just close some of these things down to see if I can show a bit more code. It's a bit limited sometimes at this resolution. So okay. So we've got a couple of things that we need to do once we've created the site in SharePoint. So there's some SharePoint specific stuff that we end up doing. And once we've created the site in SharePoint, this SharePoint site here is actually a CRM class. So this is part of the CRM SDK where we're setting up a site, and I'll show you where that is in, might as well go and show you where that is in CRM. So if I go to the administration part of CRM and I look at settings and then document management, go. So we've got a number of SharePoint sites, and then we've got a number of document locations. So the first thing we want to do is set up the SharePoint site and make sure that exists. And then the document location is pretty much saying this document library or this folder maps to this specific entity. So if I actually look at the ones I've already got set up, I've got a bunch of them here. So here you go, combined knowledge is mapped to, and if I open this particular line item, you can see there are a couple of things here. It's regarding. Regarding is CRM's way of saying that's the entity we're associating it with. And the parent site or location is actually the site that we created. So as I created my SharePoint site, which we know how to do that in client-side object model stuff, once it's been created, we're going to use the XRM, the CRM SDK bit. And you can see, I don't know if you can see that, it's basically part of the XRM service context. We're going to set the site. So the first thing it would do is create this parent site or location, which is the combined knowledge site. So we did that. And then following that, we've got the site set up. So you set the account name, we save the changes. So this is CRM's version of the client object model, basically, so using that SDK bit. And then following that, we need to set up the document libraries as well. So the document libraries, in this case, we know it's called CRM. So we're going to grab the CRM document library, and then we're going to create a document location, which results in this list item in the active document locations here. And you can see it's pretty much just saying, it's just pretty much saying that the location is CRM within that site, and it's regarding this particular entity. So it's using, I guess, CRM client-side object model code to do that as soon as we've provisioned the site in SharePoint. I guess there's an argument for saying you could start using the service bus again for that and having CRM subscribe to it, but CRM is probably the only place that needs to know about the specific location. Yeah?
So how do you manage the identity of the user? Is it just, like when the site gets created in SharePoint, is that
Yeah.
just the client side user, or do they need permission to create this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in my code so the question was about the identity of creating the sites in SharePoint. You can decide whether you want to have a provisioning user, and that's probably what we would end up doing. So you'd set up a user account or service account, which we would use to do that provisioning in SharePoint. So the user themselves is probably not allowed to create sites, but the service identity would be able to do that. So in my case, we've got create site, and I'm just picking up some credentials here from my configuration. So in the Cloud Configuration Manager is basically the way that we manage the configuration settings or application configuration settings for cloud services. I'm just picking up the username and password of a user that I'm going to pass using the typical client context that we use for client-side object model stuff in SharePoint. So I'm just saying it's this user, and that's part of my subscriber configuration. So that's it. So if you're using ADFS, as long as you can use the client-side object model using ADFS, you can pick up your token first and then use that to authenticate against SharePoint. You could do that. I mean, as long as you can use the client-side object model, that's the key. So if you've got it hooked up where you can do that already, you can use it with ADFS. Yep.
Hi. How's your suggestion to escalate this to multiple CRM instances, like for multiple customers, multiple clients or so?
So you've got multiple CRM tenants, I guess. Is it CRM Online?
Imagine that we deploy an application to the Office store
Yeah.
that monitors each CRM of our customer in order to do an integration between the customer CRM and the customer SharePoint site. How can we escalate this to manage, I don't know, 1,000 customers or so?
And each customer's got its own CRM instance.
Yes.
I mean, I'll be honest, the configuration, I maybe oversimplified some of the steps, but there is a very good sequence of step-by-step steps to follow in TechNet for a single tenant configuration. The complex bit is probably the Azure ACS integration stuff, and I don't think that you can script that all currently. Or if you could, you'd have to do it yourself. But that's effectively what that tool is doing. So the plugin registration tool here, which we're not using to register our own custom plugin, we're using to register the service endpoint. You could potentially use that, or you could use some code that does the equivalent of registering your own custom plugin. You're probably looking at your own custom plugin for it, I think, because I just don't think you can configure it programmatically. But I'll get back to you on that. It's quite an interesting thing to script it up. Most customers just do it once and then it's done, you know. So if you want to do it many times, I don't think there's a good example of that yet. But you might be able to with PowerShell. I haven't tried. So I think, I've been through some of the code. Again, I'm happy to share the code. I'll probably share the Yammer code because it's just simpler. It's just a couple of lines of that. It's very straightforward. If you want the SharePoint code as well, I'll cut some of the things out because you can create. So in our case, we've got some examples where we're generating documents as well. So that's quite a nice example of when you create a new account and you add a quote entity to the account in CRM, you generate your documents in SharePoint and you link them all up together. And it's got the document pre-populated with stuff. And that's just using the OpenXML SDK, which wasn't something I was going to show in detail today, but there are some. If I show the View Solution Explorer, yeah, so we can generate documents using the OpenXML SDK. as part. So if, for example, someone adds a quote, you can pick up some stuff. We actually also update the managed metadata service and do a bunch of stuff. But the point really wasn't to, yeah, I guess the limits your imagination. You know, you have something updating in CRM, where do you want it to exist in different other subscribing systems? So I think if I go back and check account combined knowledge, yeah, there should be another account created there somewhere. Yeah, I don't know where that's gone. Okay, so yeah, any other questions about how to hook this kind of stuff up? I've actually got a couple of links which are very useful. So the top one, I'll just actually click on them so that we can see what we're talking about. The top one is what I was talking about. It's a very useful step-by-step, and it's quite particular. So you can see down the left-hand side here, Azure extensions for Dynamics CRM. And you pretty much have walkthroughs for most of the stuff I've seen. And I glossed over some of it because the Azure ACS bits can take a bit of time to configure that. Downloading certificates from CRM and so on. But the steps are correct, they work. So I would follow them in the first instance if you want to hook this up and give it a try. And then the other thing is to understand the service bus messaging side of things. So I talked about topics mainly today because topics is the probably it's actually, I think, the only, oh no, we're using event hubs as well, but topics is probably the most useful basic messaging service that you get with the Azure Service Bus. The queues are a bit limited, for example, but it says it quite well there. Topic provides decoupled asynchronous communication between a sender and any number of receivers. So that's why we use it. It's our favorite part of the Azure Service Bus, using it quite a lot. And the code examples are very good, so I'd encourage you to have a look at those. It's not a lot of work when I go looking at the Yammer side of things, because the Yammer post was a lot easier. It's really, I mean, this class itself, probably can't see it on this particular resolution. We're just running, picking up some config, and then we receive some messages, and that's it. Once we receive the messages, the rest is specific to that particular subscriber. So if you're talking a Yammer subscriber, it's the Yammer code, or SharePoint subscriber, it's the SharePoint code. There's more SharePoint code because we're having to do a lot more, but it's really not complicated code at all. So I would, I'll share the project so you can have a look at it. It's quite simple, I think, and it's much better than native. So yeah, any more questions? Yep.
Is there another way other than the cloud services to create a listener for the service bus?
Absolutely, yeah. I just did that because I felt that it was going to be, if you've got things running in the cloud already, you can put the listener in there. You could have a console app running somewhere else. You could have a Windows service. And all you would be doing is really using that same bit of code to receive the messages. So if you have a look, actually, probably the messaging with topics, you don't have to use the cloud service at all. You can just use the code that's there and put it wherever you like, whether it be, yeah, a Windows service or a console app or something. Anything will do. Anything that's going to run and stay running, because it's got to be listening for stuff most of the time. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any reason why it wouldn't work between CRM on-prem and SharePoint on-prem or hybrid scenario?
There's no reason that it wouldn't work between online and on-premise, or on-premise and online, or whichever way you want to do it. As long as whatever it is as a publisher has got connectivity to the service bus and a subscriber. So at the moment, we're only connecting on-premises to online or online to online, but there's no reason why you wouldn't have that, perhaps the the Windows service or something picking up some information from the service bus. The connectivity part of it is really simple. You just have the namespace, the key, and what have you, and it can pick up the messages and just runs there picking up. It doesn't know that it's in the cloud. It's just you just connect it up. So it's very flexible like that. You can even connect on-premises to on-premises if you want. But yeah, one thing I should say actually, if you don't want to go to the cloud at all, everything's on-premises, there is a version of the Azure Service Bus that you can run on-premises. But what you need for that is SQL implementation. You probably want redundant SQL as well. You're going to have a lot more infrastructure costs for that. It is free. It's part of, I think it's extension to Windows Server 2012. So you can run it as a Windows service bus, but you'll need a couple of Windows servers, a couple of SQL servers for resilience and things like that. You get a bit more control on it as well in terms of some of the message sizes and things like that. So if you've got enormous messages and you don't want to be saturating your internet connection, you might want to do something on premises. And you can do pretty much the same thing as I've shown here, except you don't get the management portal. It's all done through PowerShell and so on.
So if you already had that for, let's say, Workflow Manager, something like that on-prem,
Yeah.
could you utilise that same service bus, or would you recommend to have?
I guess it depends on the number. So the question was, can you use an existing, if you're using Workflow Manager already, could you use that for this kind of concept?
Yeah, the service bus underlying.
Yeah. I've not actually tried that. I think it depends on the number of messages and the performance scalability. If you're not doing much with it at the moment, I think it would probably work, but I can't say that I've tried it. I'll probably look into that though, because we do have some customers that are anti-cloud, let's say, that love everything that we're doing with the Azure Service Bus and want to do it on premises. So we're starting a proof of concept with some of that. Probably find out soon. Okay, well, I think that's just about time up. So sorry about some of the technical glitches getting started there. Thanks for coming. I know it's a tall order coming in at 9 o'clock after such a good night last night. Hope you had a good conference. If you've got more questions, then just ping me them on Twitter or by email. Got my contact details are there as well somewhere. So I've lost the... Yeah, so if you want to ping me on Twitter or email me, that's a short version of my email address. I'm happy to talk about this stuff. I love this architecture of connecting systems. It's something that we think as a first point of call, that's our first way of connecting things. Even if we think it's maybe overkill, it's not, because it just makes it easier and it's scalable and future-proof. And yeah, we think it's really the best model for connecting things up. Okay, thank you.